She married a human for peace, then watched him destroy armies like a god. The doors were already open when they brought me to him. No processional, no ceremony candles, no ancestral song. Just two soldiers standing on either side of a metal corridor that smelled of recycled air and cold alloy, and at the end of it, a man sitting at a table with his back half turned and a pen in his hand, writing something in a small notebook as though the most consequential diplomatic event of the decade was not scheduled to happen in the next few minutes. I had prepared for savagery. 6 pages of intelligence. Commander Marcus Hale, 39 years of age, decorated veteran of 4 campaigns including the catastrophic Vale incursion into human space that my own people still called the Battle of the Outer Ring, and that humans had apparently named Thursday. Thursday. I stood in that doorway wearing formal bone silk and every piece of ceremonial jewelry my mother had pressed into my hands, with dry eyes and no embrace, and I watched the man who was about to become my husband finish his sentence, cap his pen, and only then look up at me. He said, "You're early." Not a welcome, not a greeting, not even the rehearsed diplomatic phrase the briefing document had promised he would deliver. "You're early." I stepped inside. My 2 attendants, Nira and Cass, the only veil the humans had permitted on the station, moved to flank me. They were afraid. I could smell it, that high copper sharpness our bodies produce when the threat center fires and the body decides whether to run. They were trying to hide it. They were not succeeding. Marcus Hale stood from the table. He was not what the files had prepared me for in any way I had a category for. He was not large by human standards, from what I understood of human standards. He was not loud, not polished, not filling the room with his own importance the way every Vale model of human officer behavior had predicted. He wore a dark uniform with very few decorations on it, which surprised me because every human delegate at the preliminary peace negotiations had worn enough medals to ballast a cargo loader. He had brown hair going to gray at the temples, a jaw that had been broken at some point in his life and healed very slightly wrong, and eyes that were a color I did not have a Vale word for, somewhere between gray and green. The exact shade of a sky in the last moment before a pressure system closes in and changes everything about the air around you. He looked at me the way a person looks at a horizon they have decided to cross. Not hungry, not possessive, just measuring, deciding how to read something. I had prepared for desire, for conquest, for the territorial gleam my advisors had described with careful language across 11 briefing sessions. I had 11 response protocols for that. I had nothing for being studied like a navigational problem by a man who had not yet finished being calm. "Lady Vasanth," he said. His pronunciation was nearly correct, which meant he had practiced it, deliberately, without anyone requiring him to. "Marcus Hale, I assume they have told you everything they want you to know about me." "And more," I said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. It barely qualified as an expression. "I'm sure," he said. The ceremony was performed by a civil administrator named Owen, a thin and clearly unhappy man who read from a screen with the energy of someone who had drawn the shortest possible straw and was determined to finish the job before anyone could make it worse. 4 witnesses attended, all human, all soldiers. None of them looked at Marcus the way you look at a groom. They looked at him the way you look at something large that has agreed to hold still, and you are quietly, carefully grateful that it is holding still. One of them, a soldier I later learned was called Leon, had a scar running from his left ear all the way down to his collarbone. He stood closest to the door. He did not take his eyes off Marcus for the entire ceremony. The vows were not traditional for either species. They were contractual, a peace agreement dressed in the borrowed language of commitment, full of territorial clauses and conduct conditions and mutual obligation language that read like a treaty because it was one. I spoke my portion in formal Vale and then in human standard because the briefing had told me Marcus did not speak Vale and I had been instructed to accommodate. Marcus spoke his portion in a voice that did not waver, did not soften, did not rise or fall from its one level. It carried the words from one end of the room to the other with the efficiency of a man completing work that needed to be done. Owen announced us joined under the combined station accords and left with a speed that suggested a prior commitment in a different star system. The witnesses followed. Nira and Cass looked at me for direction. I gave them the hand gesture for wait outside, and they were gone before my arm fell. Marcus and I stood on opposite sides of the room. I had contingencies for this moment. My oldest sister Yura had survived her own political arrangement 20 years ago and given me advice over an evening I would remember for a long time. I had scripts. I had fallback positions for the fallback positions. Marcus picked up his notebook from the table and said, "The quarters are through the second corridor. I'll show you which room is yours." I followed him. The walk through the station took 3 minutes. I counted. We passed 4 human soldiers in the corridors, and each of them tracked Marcus as he moved past them, not with their heads, but with a stillness that originated somewhere behind the eyes, the way a person goes still when something they are monitoring changes position. They looked at me with open curiosity, not hostility, just the particular attention of people cataloging a new element and deciding where to place it in the arrangement they already understand. One of them, a young soldier with a close-cropped beard who was carrying a maintenance kit toward the lower level, nodded at Marcus as they passed. Marcus nodded back, a fraction of emotion, the minimum acknowledgement that constituted a response. The soldier's eyes followed us for the length of the corridor. I noticed that none of them spoke to him, not because they were afraid to, because they had already assessed whether a greeting was warranted by the current situation and determined it was not. They communicated with him in the language of people who have been in tight spaces together and have learned to compress their exchanges to what is strictly necessary. I had spent 4 months preparing for a certain kind of man. I had not prepared for a man whose own people had developed an entire vocabulary of silence around him. The station called Helix 7 sat at the gravitational midpoint between Vale and human border space, assembled specifically to house this arrangement and everything it was supposed to represent. It smelled of metal and filtered air, and something warm and slightly rich rising from 2 levels below, which I eventually identified as food being cooked in the communal kitchen. The corridors were functional and not unpleasant, and had the particular quality of spaces built for purpose rather than comfort, which I found more honest than I had expected. My room had a viewport facing into the dark. The bed was designed with Vale physiology in mind, lower to the floor and wider than human standard, which meant someone had read the physical accommodation guidelines with actual care rather than performing care. A small communications device sat on the writing desk beneath the viewport. "If you need anything adjusted," Marcus said from the doorway, "you can tell me, or you can contact station administration directly. Either way works." "Is that how this arrangement functions?" I said. "Through administration? You can come to me. I am saying you are not required to." I turned and looked at him directly. Why make that distinction on the first day? He considered the question with what I would later understand was his standard pause, not uncertainty, but the deliberate pause of a man who decides whether a thought is worth saying before he commits to saying it. "Because you probably expect to need permission," he said. "You don't. Not on this station." He left. I stood in the center of my room with bone silk and jewelry and the full weight of what my family had exchanged me for pressing down from every direction, and I listened to his footsteps move down the corridor at a pace that was neither fast nor slow. Just decided. Each step a thing already resolved before his foot came down. Nira found me still standing in the same position 10 minutes later. "Lady Vasanth," she said, in the careful tone she used when she had decided I needed handling. "He is nothing like the files," I said. She touched my arm. "Is that good?" Through the viewport, human space spread in every direction. Stars that had never been given Vale names, systems that had fought us and won, and then, against every precedent in galactic history, offered peace terms instead of continued pursuit. I pressed one hand flat against the cold of the viewport glass. I told myself I would understand this man before he understood anything about me. I told myself this was strategy. I knew, in the quiet place below the strategy, that it was already failing. My mother had said 3 words at the end of our final meeting before the transport shuttle took me to the border relay. "Survive this." Nothing about enduring it gracefully, or representing the house with distinction, or finding advantage in the arrangement for the Dominion's benefit. Just survive. The instruction of a person who had already made her peace with sending someone into something she could not fully predict. I had taken those 3 words with me across the border, and into this station and into this room, and I had treated them as sufficient. Survive this. I was surviving. I was surviving in a room with Veil specification dimensions on a human station in the gravitational middle of nothing, wearing ceremonial jewelry I had not yet taken off, because removing it felt like a concession I had not decided to make. I pressed my hand against the viewport glass and felt the cold of the dark outside traveling through it, and I thought that surviving into something you had not been told to expect was its own kind of problem. A problem that the 3 words had not covered. I took off the jewelry. I put it in the small box Nira had packed for exactly this purpose. I stood in the center of the room in bone silk in the dark, and I thought, for the first time since the transport shuttle left Veil space, what happens next is not written anywhere. Then I went to sleep, or tried to. The room was the right temperature and the right dimensions, and the sounds of the station were the same low mechanical hum every deep space installation produces, the kind that should soothe and instead makes you more aware of the distance between yourself and anything familiar. I went to the common area. He was there. Marcus sat at the low table near the viewport with a cup of something hot and a second notebook open in front of him. He looked up when I came in. He did not appear surprised. He did not invite me to sit or suggest I might prefer somewhere else. He simply left the space around him open, the way a person does when they are used to being around people who need to decide for themselves. I sat across from him. For a while there was only the hum of the station, and the dark through the viewport, and the faint smell of whatever was in his cup. Outside, the stars that human navigators had named after their own history looked back. I did not know their names. I knew ours for that region of space, the designations our cartographers had assigned during the first century of Veil expansion, technical names built for function rather than meaning. I wondered if human names for stars were different. I thought they probably were. "What are you writing?" I asked. "Notes," he said. "On what?" "Current things," he said. I wanted to push. Something about him stopped me. Not a wall exactly, but the sense of a person who operates in a register that does not require volume, who says what they mean in the smallest unit that carries the meaning, and who would produce nothing useful in response to pressure except less of themselves. "You practiced my name," I said instead. He looked up. "Your name deserves to be said correctly," he said. I sat with that. The station hummed. The stars did not move. Across from me, Marcus Hale went back to his notebook and wrote something in it, and I sat in the communal area of a human installation at the gravitational midpoint of nothing and thought about the word deserve applied to a name by a person who did not have to think about it. Then I went back to my room and lay in the dark with my eyes open until the station's light cycle shifted to morning, thinking about a man who had practiced a name his government had never required him to learn, in a language he had never been asked to speak. It was a small thing. I told myself it would stay small. I was wrong about that from the beginning. Weeks passed. I had come to Helix 7 with the intention of observing Marcus Hale the way our intelligence teams observed everything, at distance, systematically, without letting the subjects sense they were being catalogued. I kept a record in the small journal Nira brought me from the first Veil supply delivery. I wrote in it every evening, sometimes for a long time. What I noticed first was the economy of him. He moved through the station without waste. No unnecessary gesture, no conversation that exceeded what the situation required, no seat taken that placed him at the center of a room when the edge was available. His office on the 3rd level had the desk facing the wall rather than the door. Human officers, in my experience of the preliminary negotiations, had performed from the front of every room they occupied. Marcus Hale performed nothing. He simply went where the work was and did it. In the second week, station administration received a formal dispute between a Veil garrison soldier and a human one over something minor in the shared equipment rotation schedule. These disputes happened on every joint station I had ever read about. There were protocols. Marcus handled it in 7 minutes in the corridor outside the equipment room, standing between them, speaking to each in turn, his voice at the same level throughout. He did not invoke authority. He did not threaten or resolve it by simply applying seniority and closing the discussion. When both soldiers had returned to their duties, the Veil soldier turned at the junction and gave Marcus a single, slow nod, the Veil gesture of acknowledgement between equals. Marcus returned it exactly, angle and duration matching, which meant he had either been taught it specifically or had observed it carefully enough to replicate it. I wrote both possibilities in my journal and could not determine which was more interesting. In the third week, I watched him read in the common area for 2 hours on a rest cycle evening. He read the way he did everything, without fidgeting, without checking the time, without the restless performance of a person who wants to be seen being productive. He simply read. The book was in Human Standard, and I could not see the title from across the room. I did not cross the room to look. I stayed where I was and catalogued the fact of him being completely still for 2 hours, which I had not previously observed any person manage. I wrote that down too. The soldiers of Helix 7, 12 human and 7 Veil, on rotating garrison duty, treated him with a quality of attention I had not previously seen directed at any one person. It was not quite deference. It was not quite fear. It was the specific, contained alertness of people who have agreed to be in the room with something and are honoring that agreement with the full focus they possess. The way you honor an agreement made with something that you respect enough not to become careless around. Leon, the soldier with the scar who had stood closest to the door during the ceremony, never sat at the same table as Marcus during shared meals. Not from hostility. I watched them speak sometimes, brief and easy exchanges with genuine regard moving through them. Leon simply maintained a particular distance. I noticed the other soldiers made similar adjustments, small ones. A chair pulled back by half a measure, a shoulder turned a degree or two. Personal space maintained, with a consistency that had nothing to do with discomfort, and everything to do with an instinct the body runs on its own when the mind is thinking about other things. I wrote this down without knowing what to do with it. What I did know, by the end of the third week, was this. Leon had been somewhere with Marcus. Of that I was certain even without documentation. The specific way he moved around him was the movement of a person who has witnessed something they did not expect to witness and has carried it in their posture ever since, lighter on the surface than underneath. Leon stood between Marcus and the attention of new personnel arriving on the station, not formally, not at anyone's instruction, but with the practiced ease of someone who has made a private decision and implements it quietly every day. He made it look like natural conversation, like the ordinary movement of a person who happens to end up between a question and its intended target. He was, I decided, a chosen buffer, a man who felt he owed something and had found the only way available to him to pay it. I asked him about it once, in the fourth week, passing in the corridor on the way to the common area. Just 2 words. I said, "Kesh Hollow?" He looked at me for a long moment with his scar catching the corridor light, and then he said, "Not mine to tell," and kept walking. That was the entirety of it. I wrote it in my journal word for word. They did not see me. One was telling a story, or the edges of a story, that the other was half dismissing, half believing. I caught only fragments. A name, a place, the Reaper of Kesh Hollow. I searched the station's open historical database that night. Kesh Hollow appeared once. A single line. A Veil incursion repelled 12 years ago on a human colony world at the far edge of their border space. Casualties were listed on the Veil side as significant. The human casualty count was listed as none. I read that line twice. Then I searched for the phrase the soldiers had used and found exactly nothing. No historical entry. No military designation. No archived report. I wrote to my sister Yura. She had access to the family's intelligence channels and the judgment to use them carefully. I asked her to find what she could and send it when she had something worth sending. Her reply came 3 days later. She had found a file, classified above her clearance level. She could read the outside edges of it, the title, the date range, the conflict classification, but could not open it. What she could tell me was that the file covered a 48-hour engagement at a human colony world 12 years ago. The Veil ground force involved had numbered over 600. The colony's civilian population had numbered approximately 9,000. The human garrison had evacuated before the ground force reached the settlement. The file was classified at my own government's request. We had asked them to bury it. I sat with that for a very long time. Long enough that Nira checked on me twice and said nothing either time, because she could read from the set of my shoulders that I was working through something and would speak when I was ready. I thought about what it meant that we had made that request. My government had looked at whatever was in a 48-hour engagement file and decided that the galaxy knowing about it was worse for us than the galaxy not knowing. Not worse for humanity. For us. We had been the ones who wanted that particular story kept quiet. We had asked for the record to be reduced to a single line in an open database. A Veil incursion repelled. Casualties significant on the Veil side. None on the human side. None. 630 on one side. None on the other. And my government's subsequent position had been, please do not let the wider galactic community read the details of how that number became none. The answer to what lived inside those 48 hours was somewhere on this station, eating in the common area and writing notes in a small notebook, and my government had asked that it be assigned here as a diplomat. I was sitting with it when Marcus knocked on my door at the usual evening hour, not to enter, but to say that food was being prepared in the common area and that I was welcome. He had done this every single evening since the first night. I had declined the first few times. I had begun accepting in the second week, partly from actual hunger, and partly because declining felt like losing ground in a contest I had not agreed to enter and could not seem to step back from. I opened the door. He looked at me, the measuring look, calibrating something specific. You found something, he said. Not a question, the same delivery as everything else. A fact he was stating. I was doing research, I said. Into what? History. A pause of exactly 2 seconds, the pause I had catalogued 17 times in my journal by that point. You found GodHFY, he said. I did not answer. Adrian cooks on Wednesdays, he said. He is better than the rotation average. The food tonight is worth eating. He walked toward the common area. I stood in my doorway for a moment. Then I followed him. We ate at the low table by the viewport. The food was genuinely better, seasoned with actual care, warm in a way that went beyond temperature. Marcus ate with focused attention, fueling something, not performing enjoyment. I ate and thought about a classified file and a government request and the number none beside the human casualty count. You were at GodHFY, I said. He did not look up from his plate. Yes. The file is classified at our request. Yes. How many in the incursion force? He looked at me then, just for a moment. 630, he said. Said it the way Owen had read the vows. A number carried from one side of the room to the other without being dropped. And you, I said. And me, he said. A silence arrived between us, with different weight than the usual silence. Marcus finished his meal. He set down his utensils and looked at the viewport. 9,000 civilians, he said, still looking at the stars outside. The garrison had already evacuated. Someone had to stay. He said it as a condition, an equation, a variable in a situation that required addressing. Were you afraid? I asked. He picked up his cup. He drank, the whole time, he said. I had been ready for no. The yes reached something in me before I could stop it. He stood, said good night, with the same economy he applied to everything, and left the common area. I sat by the viewport for a long time after. My oldest sister Yura had told me, during the evening she gave me her practical advice, that the most dangerous thing about a political arrangement was not the person you were arranged with. It was the possibility of finding something inside the arrangement that you had not been warned about and could not easily classify. In the 6th week I started looking forward to Wednesdays. Not because of the food. I recognized this as a problem. I cataloged it alongside everything else in my journal. I told myself it was intelligence gathering. I told myself every observation served a function within the strategy I was maintaining. I told myself this with decreasing conviction across the following 2 weeks, until Yura's next message arrived about something entirely unrelated, and ended with a single line. You sound like someone making decisions they have not admitted to yet. She was usually right. Marcus and I had begun taking our morning cups at the viewport table before the day cycle began, before the rest of the station was fully moving. No one had proposed or agreed to this. It had accumulated, the way things do when 2 people follow the same instinct on enough consecutive mornings. We talked about small things, the administrative schedule for the week, a communications relay that had been malfunctioning for 3 weeks waiting on replacement parts, the stars visible from the viewport, which were different from the stars visible from either of our home systems, and which occupied us on one particular morning for nearly 30 unnoticed minutes. We did not talk about Kesh Hollow again. We did not talk about what the arrangement was, or what either of us expected from it, or what happened when it ended. We talked around those things, the way you walk a familiar path in the dark, not because you cannot see the edges, but because you have agreed, without saying so, to use a smaller light than the situation might otherwise call for. In the 8th week, Adrian broke his wrist in a training exercise and could not cook for a month. Marcus cooked on Wednesday. He was not better than Adrian and was not trying to be. He cooked with the same attention he brought to everything else, specific and without display. He set the food down and sat and ate and looked at the viewport. I ate. It was good. I did not say so that night. I told him the next morning, at the table over our warm cups, because I had given myself one day to determine whether I was saying it for strategic reasons or simply because it was true. I said it because it was true. He said, "Good to know," and looked back at the stars. I wrote in my journal that night that I was in considerable trouble. 6 days later, the attack came. It came at dawn on a Tuesday. Not at the negotiated border, not at one of the 3 official flashpoints the joint diplomatic channels spent most of their time and energy monitoring. It came at Helix 7 itself, at the peace station, at the exact location where 2 species had agreed, however uneasily, to attempt something other than destroying each other. I was awake. I was almost always awake before the station light cycle shifted to day. The early hours were the only time the place felt as though it belonged to neither species, just to the dark outside and the hum of its own systems. The first explosion was in the docking sector. I felt it before I heard it. A low-pressure wave through the floor, the particular vibration of something structural giving way under directed force rather than gradual wear. I was out of my room before the station alarm engaged, and the alarm engaged in the second immediately following the explosion, which told me the breach was fast and planned, and that whoever had organized this had not wanted anyone to have a long warning window. Nira met me in the corridor. She was already dressed. She had not been sleeping either. "Docking level," she said. "Not an accident." The defensive alert came over the station communication system in both Human Standard and Veil, one of the few joint protocols implemented with genuine thoroughness by both sides. The message was short: hostile boarding action in progress, multiple entry points breached, all garrison personnel to designated defensive positions. Hostile boarding action, multiple entry points. "Cass," I said immediately. "Lower level, I have her on the personal channel." I was already moving. "Tell her to get to the central hold." A second explosion, closer than the first. The station lights shifted from white to amber as secondary power engaged, which meant the primary power coupling in the docking sector was already destroyed. Infrastructure targeted first. They knew the layout. Someone had given it to them. My own people. The garrison was 12 human soldiers and 7 Veil on this rotation cycle. Helix 7 was a diplomatic installation, not a military post. The garrison existed to satisfy the protocol requirement and to signal mutual commitment, not to repel a coordinated boarding action by a force that had done its preparation carefully. I turned the junction corner, and Marcus was already in the corridor, already dressed, already moving. The long-frame weapon that lived mounted beside his door, which I had noted in my journal on the second day and classified under standard officer protocol, was in his hands now. It looked different in his hands under the amber emergency lighting than it had looked on the mount. It looked like a thing that had been waiting for its actual purpose. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No. What are we facing?" His jaw tightened. The first time I had ever seen his face register anything resembling strain. "Veil Incursion Unit," he said. 40 to 60 personnel, based on the breach pattern and the number of entry points they hit simultaneously. They used modified docking equipment. Our scanners read them as a cargo carrier until they were already inside the station. Veil. One cold, complete second in which I understood exactly what I was looking at. The hardline faction within the Dominion, the council members who had voted against the treaty and called it submission, and spent 8 weeks in private channels saying things about me I did not intend to repeat, had not been satisfied with political opposition. They had done something with their dissatisfaction. They had sent soldiers to a peace station with scanner masking hardware that had to have been ordered and fabricated before the treaty was signed. Which meant when my mother pressed my hands with dry eyes and turned away, someone in the adjacent room had already issued the order for this. "How long before they reach habitation level?" I said. "They are past the cargo sublevel already," Marcus said. 5 to 7 minutes before they reach us, depending on their advance pace. The garrison cannot hold this." "No," he said. A number he had already run. "Not a judgment." "Upper dock," I said. "Emergency evac shuttles are mounted there." They entered from the lower dock. "The upper access should still be clear." "It is," he said. "They would close exits after entry, not before. They are moving upward through the station, not laterally." "Then we go now. You and me and Nira and Cass when we find her. The garrison follows when they can." He looked at me. 2 seconds. "Get Nira," he said. "Upper corridor, third junction, left branch, 2 levels up. There is a maintenance access point to the upper dock. The entry code is 7741. Go." "Come with us," I said. "I'll follow." "There are 60 of them." 40 to 60, he said. "Marcus." I said his name the way you say something when the word itself is the argument. He looked at me, and his face did something I had not seen it do before. Not fear, and not its absence, but something that had traveled past both of those states a long time ago, and no longer needed either of them to orient itself. Something that had been to a place where fear and its absence stopped being the relevant categories, and had come back from that place and learned to function without them. "I've done this before," he said. Quiet, the way he had said, the whole time. A fact, a condition of the situation, a variable that had been accounted for. I searched his face for something I could use to argue. There was nothing to use. Not because he was being unreasonable, he was the most reasonable person on the station, but because he was telling me the truth with the same directness he applied to everything, and the truth was something I was not ready to have confirmed by standing here while he went toward it. "Kesh Hollow," I said. He did not answer. He checked the weapon with a movement that lasted less than 2 seconds and contained approximately a decade of repetition. He looked at me one final time. 7741, he said. "Do not wait more than 20 minutes. Nira's hand found my arm. Marcus was already moving down the corridor in the other direction, down and toward the sound coming from below us now. Not the chaos of soldiers in a hurry, but the disciplined, measured advance of people who knew exactly where they were going and were confident about what they would find when they arrived. I watched him turn the corner. He did not look back. "Lady Vasanth," Nira said, her voice carrying the particular urgency of someone who has decided that being gentle is no longer the priority. "Now." We moved. Upper corridor, third junction, left branch, 2 levels up. The amber emergency strips along the floor threw everything into a color that made the station look like a different place entirely. The same walls and doors and corridor widths, but lit from a different angle, suggesting different things. We found Cass at the maintenance access ladder, pressed flat against the wall with her color bleached to nearly nothing, both hands against the metal as though the station needed holding. She grabbed my arm when she saw me. "Can you move?" I said. She nodded. 7741. The access panel accepted the code and the door opened. Up the ladder, all 3 of us, into the upper dock. 1 emergency evac shuttle in its cradle, with the dock seals intact and the status indicators reading green. We could leave right now. We could be in neutral space before the garrison below was overrun, and before whatever the hardliners had sent to this station accomplished what it had come to accomplish. I did not move toward the shuttle. "There is an internal surveillance panel," I said to Nira. "Secondary power coverage. Is it still active?" She went to the wall panel without being asked twice and checked it. "Partial," she said. 3 level feeds. Lower cargo, main corridor, docking junction. "Show me the main corridor." "Lady Vasanth. He told us to get to the shuttle and not to wait more than—" "Show me." She showed me. The main corridor feed was degraded, amber lit, the resolution poor, and the angle limited by where the secondary camera sat in the junction ceiling. But it was enough. The garrison soldiers had formed a choke point defense behind a barricade of equipment crates at the main corridor junction, 7 of them, positioned with the compressed efficiency of people who have been trained for exactly this situation and know that their job is to buy time rather than win. The incursion unit reached the choke point at the edge of the frame. The garrison held for approximately 90 seconds. Then the weight of numbers pushed through, and the garrison pulled back in the coordinated retreat of soldiers who know that holding the position was never the objective and that living to regroup is the actual mission. They moved into the side corridor, and the incursion unit pushed past them and into the main corridor, heading toward habitation level, toward us. And then at the far edge of the frame, at the very limit of what the secondary camera could capture, something changed in the behavior of the incursion unit's front element. They stopped. Not a halt order, no visible command from a leader. The front of the column simply stopped moving forward. Then the front of the column began moving backward, pressing into the middle section of the column, and the audio feed, thin and crackling through secondary power, carried sounds that I could not resolve into individual identifiable events. I stood in front of that monitoring panel with Cass on one side and Nira on the other, and I watched what happened in that amber corridor for 4 minutes. I could not see Marcus in the camera's limited field. I could see what was in front of him, and then what was no longer in front of him. The incursion unit had entered that corridor as a disciplined formation, the kind of unit that moves with shared intention, each person aware of the one beside them, the whole shape of it coherent and purposeful. In training materials I had studied once about human tactical doctrine, I had read about the difference between a group and a unit, the latter being the word for something that has developed collective momentum, a shared direction that is harder to stop than any individual within it. The formation in that corridor stopped having collective momentum in the second minute. I watched it become a group. I watched the group become individuals. I watched the corridor empty. Nira made a sound beside me. Not a word. The sound a person makes when they see something their training did not include a category for, and the body has to produce something in response anyway. Cass was not making sounds. She was very still. I stood there and I thought about a single-line database entry, and a classified file, and a government request, and the none beside the human casualty count, and I understood, in a way that moved through me like cold through glass, that the file had not been classified because the content was embarrassing to humanity. It had been classified because the content was terrifying. At the end of 4 minutes, the main corridor was empty of everything that had been advancing through it. The garrison soldiers reappeared in the frame. They were looking at something off-screen. None of them moved toward it. They stood where they were, looking, and the quality of their stillness was the same quality I had watched them maintain around Marcus Hale at every meal, every briefing, every shared moment in the station's common spaces. The particular stillness of people who have agreed to stand near something and are honoring that agreement with everything they have. The station alarm was still running. The sounds that had been underneath the alarm were gone. At 7 minutes past the moment the corridor cleared, there were footsteps on the maintenance ladder. Marcus came through the access hatch. His weapon was slung. There was a cut on his left forearm bleeding steadily into his sleeve. His breathing was slightly elevated, the first physical evidence I had seen in 63 days that his body had limits it occasionally approached. His face was exactly what it had always been, measured, decided, a horizon that had been crossed. "Ready?" he said. I stared at him. "Ready?" he said again. "There were 60 of them," I said. 43, he said. The initial count from the breach pattern was off. Cass made a sound that was not a word. Nira put a steady hand on her arm. "Where are they now?" I asked. "Secured," he said. "The garrison has them. The ones who can be secured." I did not ask him to explain the distinction. He walked past me to the shuttle and began the pre-launch sequence. His hands moved across the controls with complete stillness. I stood where I was for another moment, looking at the maintenance hatch he had come through, and at the man standing at the launch panel, and at the cut on his arm still bleeding into dark fabric, and I thought about 43 soldiers and 4 minutes and a camera feed that had shown me only the edge of something. I got into the shuttle. Nobody spoke for a long time after we cleared the station and entered open space. Cass slept eventually, exhausted in the particular way that follows fear, using everything in you, leaving nothing behind to hold your eyes open. Neera sat beside her, watching the dark through the viewport, not sleeping, not yet ready to. I sat in the co-pilot seat, which was the only other forward-facing seat with a full view of the navigation display, which was what I told myself as I sat down in it. Marcus flew manually. He always flew manually when they let him, which I knew from 2 supply runs to the nearest relay depot during my time on Helix 7. He had said once that autopilot handled the distance well enough, but he preferred to run the approach by hand. What I had thought then was that it was the stubbornness of an experienced pilot who trusted his own read of a situation over a system. What I thought now, watching his hands move across the controls with the same quiet economy as everything else, was something I was not ready to say out loud. "Tell me what happened," I said. He looked at the navigation display. "You watched the corridor feed." "I saw the corridor. I did not see what you did. You saw the result of it." "That is not the same thing," I said. He was quiet for a while. Outside the viewport, the stars had the particular stillness that only exists at the far edge of something that has already happened, after the pressure passes, and what is left is the silence it leaves behind. 43 trained soldiers, I said. Your garrison's choke point defense held them for 90 seconds before falling back. You held them for 4 minutes and they did not come through. The garrison's job was to buy time and retreat intact, he said. They did that. And your job? He looked at the navigation display. I don't have a job, he said. I am retired. I am a diplomatic attaché. I manage joint station administration functions, and I cook on Wednesdays when Adrian is unavailable. I looked at him for a long time. You did not retire, I said. You changed locations. He did not answer that. He made a small adjustment to the navigation and said, the relay depot will have a medical station. That cut should be looked at before the tissue closes wrong. I looked at his arm. The bleeding had slowed. The sleeve was dark from the elbow down. Who taught you? I said. He glanced at me. Someone taught you, I said, or you trained yourself, or both, but what you are capable of does not happen without a beginning. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the space ahead of us. Then he said, the military taught me. Then I taught myself beyond what they taught. Then they realized what I had taught myself was something they could use, and they used it. At Kesh Hollow, I said. Before Kesh Hollow, he said. Kesh Hollow was later in the sequence. Before. I sat with the word and what it meant placed in front of the file Yura had found, and the single-line historical entry, and the none beside the human casualty count. How long, I said. 12 years with the military, he said. Before that was a different kind of preparation. He said those words, the way you say something when the full version would take a decade to tell, and you have chosen, for now, to give only the coordinates. I did not push further than that. The relay depot was 40 minutes out. Through the viewport, Vale border space was visible on the left edge of the navigation display, the boundary of my people's territory, the boundary of the arrangement that someone within that territory had just tried to end. They planned this before the treaty was signed, I said. Yes, he said, which means for part of my government, the treaty was never genuine. It was cover. Hardline factions on both sides have agreed to things they never intended to honor, he said. That pattern is not unique to your government. Your government too? Not on this specific action, he said, but in principle, yes. I thought about my mother's hands and her dry eyes, about Yura's message, about being selected from among my sisters for this particular obligation, and about what it meant to represent a house in a negotiation where some of the people in the room were already planning something other than negotiation. I am sorry, I said. He looked at me. For what they intended, I said. They used the treaty as a mechanism. They used me as part of it. I am. You didn't do this, he said. I know that, I said. No, he said, and there was something new in his voice. Not warmth exactly, but a quality that had not been there before. Something unguarded, in a voice that had always had a door on it. You know that, in the rational sense. I mean, do you actually believe it? I did not answer immediately. No, I said, after a moment. He nodded. Once. The way you nodded an honest answer that was harder to give than a reassuring one. You will, he said. It takes time. I looked at him. You have carried this too, I said. Responsibility for what your government did with you. He looked at the stars for a while. His jaw moved slightly, the way it does when a person is converting a thought into language and deciding how much of the conversion to complete. Kesh Hollow was not my government's fault, he said. That one was mine. Said without drama, without the careful weight you put on things when you need someone to notice the cost. Said like a coordinate. Here is where I am. Here is what happened here. I looked at the viewport. Leon, I said, and the other soldiers, they hold a different distance from you than from anyone else. They know what I can do, he said. Does that frighten them? Some, he said. Others find it reassuring. Most feel both things and do not know what to do with that, so they position themselves slightly further back and try to make it look natural. Do you mind? He considered it, the genuine kind of considering, not the pause before a prepared answer. I understand it, he said. The relay depot appeared on the navigation display, close enough to resolve its running lights. Marcus began the approach sequence without announcing it, hands moving through the steps with the same quiet precision as everything else he did. What are you? I said. He looked at me. I do not mean that as an insult, I said. I mean your designation, your military classification, what you are, specifically. Officially, he said, I am a retired commander with a diplomatic posting. Unofficially. He was quiet. The landing approach occupied his hands but not the part of him that was thinking. There is a word, he said, in an old human language that very few people still speak fluently. It does not translate cleanly into human standard or into Vael. The closest approximation is something like the one who goes last. He paused. Or sometimes, the one who stays. Someone had to stay. He had said those words at the viewport table about Kesh Hollow, said them like a condition, a variable requiring resolution. I turned and looked at him fully, at the side of his face, the wrong-heeled jaw, the gray at his temples, the eyes that were the color of a sky in the last moment before everything about the air changes. They will send the incursion unit's composition to the Dominion Council, I said. The names, the unit, the authorization trail, the hardware sourcing, there will be consequences. Yes, he said. And the wider galactic community, I said slowly, will learn what happened on this station, what one officer did against 43 soldiers in 4 minutes. It will reach the collective worlds. The Geth sovereignty, every independent system with a monitoring relay. Word travels, he said. Word traveled from Kesh Hollow, I said. My government asked for that file to be buried, because what was in it frightened them badly enough to make that request. He said nothing. What does the rest of the galaxy do, I said, when they understand what you represent? He brought the shuttle into the final docking approach, and for a moment, his hands were fully occupied with the sequence. Then he said, quietly, they remember why they agreed to peace terms. The depot's docking lights came on. I sat in the co-pilot's seat and thought about a treaty 2 species had signed, and the thing inside that treaty that nobody in the negotiation room had said aloud, but that everyone on both sides had understood completely. Helix 7 had not been built because both sides wanted peace. It had been built because one side had demonstrated, in 48 hours at a place called Kesh Hollow, exactly what it was capable of producing, and the other side had looked at that demonstration and made a very clear-eyed calculation. The treaty was not an agreement between equals deciding to coexist. It was a courtesy, extended by a species that had decided, for the moment, to extend it. Marcus landed with his characteristic quiet efficiency. I looked at the side of his face, that ordinary face with its impossible history, and I felt something I was completely finished pretending was strategic. Marcus, I said. He looked at me. I did not have the right words, not in Vale, not in human standard, not in the formal diplomatic register I had trained in for 4 years before arriving at Helix 7. There was no linguistic category I had been given for what I was sitting next to, and every phrase I had that came close felt too small, or too large, or simply pointed in the wrong direction. I am glad, I said finally, that you stayed. He looked at me for 2 seconds. Then something moved in those gray-green eyes that I had not seen move there in 63 days of careful observation. "So am I," he said. He opened the shuttle door and let the depot's medical team inside. The Dominion Council met in emergency session 3 days after we reached the relay depot. I was not present. I was 3 relay stations and a communication lag away, sitting in a borrowed office with a viewport that faced a section of space I had not previously seen, learning its star pattern by repetition because it was something to do while I waited. Yura sent me a message the moment the session concluded, which was how I learned that 4 senior council members had been detained pending a full investigation, that 2 more had requested emergency asylum at a neutral station, and that the leader of the hardline faction, a man named Councillor Veth, had submitted his resignation before the session began and had not been located since. My mother sent a separate message. It arrived 6 hours after Yura's. It was short. "We are addressing the situation," it said. "You are to return to Helix 7 when the station is cleared and declared safe. You are to fulfill your obligations under the Combined Station Accords. Your obligations." No question about whether I was injured, no acknowledgement of what I had witnessed, no word about what the House intended to do with the information that its 3rd daughter had been used as cover for an operation someone had already planned when they pressed jewelry into her hands and turned away. Your obligations. That was all. I wrote back 3 sentences. I told her I was safe. I told her I understood my obligations clearly. Then I spent 20 minutes finding the right words for what I wrote next, and when I found them, I wrote them without revision. What I wrote was, "The arrangement you made to secure this peace is stronger than you intended it to be. Treat it accordingly." I sent the message before I could reconsider. She would understand what I meant, or she would not. Either way, I had said the true thing. The 11 days at the relay depot were their own kind of time. I had expected waiting to feel like suspension, the particular emptiness between one situation and the next. Instead, the depot had its own density. It was a working installation, transit traffic moving through it constantly, supply ships and administrative shuttles, and the occasional military escort stopping to refuel and file documentation. The common areas were never empty. The communication terminals ran continuously. I sat in the borrowed office and I worked. I prepared my formal statement for the Dominion Council's review. I drafted the communication that went to the Joint Diplomatic Oversight Committee, which required navigating 3 different bureaucratic structures simultaneously and producing a document that satisfied all 3 while saying only what I had decided to say. I did not enjoy the drafting process. I was competent at it, which is different from enjoying it, and the competence came from years of training I had accepted without enthusiasm for exactly these kinds of situations. Marcus worked too. I saw him in the common area in the early hours, notebook or tablet, writing things that were not for me to read and that I did not try to read. He had his arm treated by the depot's medical staff the day after we arrived. He did not mention it afterward. The cut healed cleanly. We ate together in the depot's communal area on most evenings. We talked about the work ahead, the diplomatic requirements, the administrative procedures that would need to be followed before either of us could return to the station. We talked around the thing we were both carrying. Not because either of us was avoiding it, I think, because some things need the right location before they can be properly examined. Helix 7 would be the right location. Helix 7 was cleared and declared safe for reoccupation 11 days after the incursion. The Joint Administrative Review determined that the modified scanner masking hardware had been sourced through 3 intermediary suppliers, deliberately chosen to obscure the origin. The incursion unit had been recruited outside normal Vale military channels, which explained why no internal intelligence flag had been raised. All of this was documented thoroughly. All of it was delivered to the Dominion Council as a formal record. The Council did what councils do with clear and documented evidence of serious misconduct. They produced consequences significant enough to be real and contained enough to allow the structure around them to survive. The hardline faction was not eliminated. It was reduced and warned. I thought about this on the shuttle returning to Helix 7. I thought about how political systems manage threats from within, and about the difference between eliminating something and making its continued activity cost more than any available benefit. The hardliners had sent 43 soldiers to a peace station with scanner masking hardware and a plan that had been in development before the ink on the treaty was dry. The cost of that action had been demonstrated, very clearly, by one person, in 4 minutes. I thought the hardliners would be doing arithmetic for a long time. Marcus sat across from me in the return shuttle. He had a new notebook, purchased at the relay depot while I was in the communications room, and he was writing in it with the same steady attention he brought to everything. Leon sat in the rear section with 2 garrison soldiers returning to their posts, talking about something in low voices that made Leon laugh once, a genuine laugh, sudden and unguarded, a sound I had never heard from him before. He looked briefly surprised by his own laugh, as though it had arrived before he approved it. I watched Marcus write. "What are you writing now?" I said. He looked up. "Notes. Still current things." That corner of his mouth moved, further than usual, slightly more current than last time, he said. I looked at the viewport. "The Dominion Council will send a formal request through the Joint Diplomatic Channel," I said. "Within the week, they will want an official statement confirming that the peace arrangement remains active and in effect. They'll receive one," he said. "And the record of what happened on the station," I said carefully, "of what you did. It is already circulating within the Dominion. It will reach the collective worlds, the Geth sovereignty, every monitoring relay in the independent systems. All of them will draw the same conclusion." "Which is," he said, "that the human military placed its most capable asset on a diplomatic posting," I said, "not as an honor for service, as a statement about the nature of the peace arrangement." He looked at the notebook in his hands. "Were you," I said, "placed here as a deliberate statement?" He was quiet for a moment that had a different quality than his usual pauses. "I was placed here," he said finally, "because the diplomatic corps determined that the position required someone who could not be removed from it by force. That was the specific requirement. I met it. Because of Kesh Hollow. Because of what came after Kesh Hollow," he said, "and what came after that. There were other engagements. The classification level on most of them is higher than your sister's clearance could reach." Other engagements. I thought about the single line in the historical database, the 630, the none. I thought about 12 years of military service, and the word before, said so quietly, when I asked how long. Before Kesh Hollow. Before, as though Kesh Hollow had been the middle of something, not the beginning, not even close to the beginning. "How many total?" I said. He looked up. "You do not have to answer," I said. He looked back at the notebook. "Enough," he said, "that they concluded I should be retired, which is not the same thing as being released. It means I go where they need the message delivered, and I deliver it by being present, and they hope that presence alone is sufficient to accomplish the objective." At Kesh Hollow, I said, presence was not sufficient. "No," he said. "At Kesh Hollow, I had not yet been retired." Said without performance. A before and after, a change in classification, a different kind of deployment. And on Helix 7, I said slowly, was presence sufficient? He looked at me. "For 43, he said, "it was not." I turned back to the viewport. I thought about what it meant that he had been retired, what retirement meant in the vocabulary of a military institution that produced people like Marcus Hale. Not release. He had said that himself. Not the end of usefulness, but a reclassification of how the usefulness was applied. The retired version went where presence could accomplish what active deployment used to accomplish. Presence, the fact of him standing in a room, being known to be in a room, the knowledge carried by anyone who had read the right files or heard the right fragments of story. And sometimes, as on Helix 7, presence was not sufficient. And then the retired version did what the unretired version had done. Only now it was quieter, less documented, more buried. I looked at his profile. He was watching the navigation display. His face had the same quality it always had, the particular stillness of something that has been to its limit and come back and is no longer bothered by the distance between the limit and the ordinary world. "How many others are there?" I said. "Like you." He was quiet for a moment. "Fewer than the people who think about that question would prefer," he said. I took that in slowly. "And the ones who are not like you," I said, "the ones at the next level of classification." He looked at the stars. "The galaxy is fortunate," he said, "that it has not yet required them. The stars between the relay depot and Helix 7 were the same stars I had been looking at through the borrowed office viewport for 11 days. I had cataloged them without intending to, by repetition, because looking at them was easier than looking at the inside of my own processing. I had cataloged them the same way I had cataloged everything else about the past 63 days. At distance, systematically, telling myself it was intelligence work. I wrote to my mother, I said. I know. She copied the diplomatic channel. Something sharp moved through me. She copied the diplomatic standard protocol for communications between treaty party family members and their home governments, he said. Not defending her, stating a fact of the system they both existed within. My communications home are copied the same way. What do you write home? I said. He glanced at the notebook. Reports. To whom? My commanding officer, he said. Technically retired, technically not. I looked at the notebook in his hands, at his still hands, at the cut on his arm that had been properly treated at the depot and was healing cleanly under the bandage. Are you writing a report right now? Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile, the relative of a smile, in a person who has not smiled casually for a long time and is remembering how the motion works. No, he said. What then? He turned the notebook and held it so I could see the open page. On the page was a precise, careful sketch of the viewport window and the star pattern visible through it. In the corner of the sketch, small and exact, was a silhouette of a figure sitting on the other side of the viewport frame. Me. Sitting exactly as I had been sitting for the past 20 minutes while I looked at the stars. I looked at the sketch. That is not current things, I said. No, he agreed. He turned the notebook back and closed it. I looked at the viewport and the stars and the space between two home systems where a peace station sat, waiting to be occupied again. I had arrived at that station with a strategy and an intention and a journal I was going to fill with intelligence about a man I had been assigned to survive. He had sketched my silhouette in his notebook while I was not looking. He had understood something before I had admitted there was anything to understand. The shuttle moved through the dark. We reached Helix 7 2 hours later. The station had been cleaned and restored by the Joint Administrative Team during the cleared period. The docking sector repairs were complete. The amber emergency lighting had been replaced with the normal white. When the shuttle docked and the hatch opened, the station smelled exactly as it always had. Metal and filtered air, and something warm rising from 2 levels below. Someone was cooking. Adrian, Marcus said, a moment before I could ask. His wrist healed. They cleared him 2 days ago. We stepped into the corridor. Nira and Cass were met by the Vale administrative staff, who had remained on station during the cleared period. There was a quiet reunion that I watched from the corner of my eye, the specific warmth of people who have come through something and are glad to see each other on the other side of it. Leon and the 2 returning garrison soldiers dispersed toward their posts with the efficiency of people who know exactly where they are supposed to be. The station felt the same, and different. The corridors had learned something during the 11 days, the way spaces learn things from what happens inside them. The same hum, the same light, the same distances between levels. But something had settled into the walls, some knowledge that the station carried, now that it had not carried before. My room was unchanged. Viewport, bed, writing desk, the small communications device. I sat on the edge of the bed and held the quiet of the room for a moment. I had arrived in this room 63 days ago, wearing bone silk and intention and the expectation of enduring something. I had sat on this same bed and looked at this same viewport and told myself I would understand this man before he understood anything about me. He had sketched my silhouette in a notebook. He had understood something before I had acknowledged there was anything to understand. That evening, at the first shared dinner back on the station, we sat at the low table by the viewport. Adrian's cooking was better than anything the return shuttle had offered. Genuinely seasoned, genuinely warm. Nira and Cass sat at the adjacent table with the 2 Vale administrative staff, their voices quiet and punctuated occasionally with something close to ease. The station held its hum. The lights were white. Ordinary. The specific ordinary that you only recognize as precious after something has tried to remove it. Marcus ate and looked at the stars. I watched him across the table, and I thought about every entry in my journal. The economy of movement, the soldier's calibrated distance, the classified file, the single-line historical entry, the practiced name, the Wednesday cooking, the wrong-heeled jaw, the 2-second pauses, the sketch in the notebook. I thought about 43 and 4 minutes and an amber corridor that the monitoring feed had shown me only the edge of. I would never see the center of it. I had thought, sometimes, in the 11 days at the relay depot, about what it had looked like from inside. What it would feel like to do what he could do and remain the person who practiced other people's names in languages not required of him. To carry what he carried and still choose, on a rest cycle evening, to sit and read without fidgeting for 2 uninterrupted hours. I did not have a framework for how those things existed in the same person. Vail understanding of capability and character treated them as separate domains, the things a person could do with their body and training, and the things a person was in themselves. The assumption was that extreme capacity in one domain shaped the other, pressed its mark into the person's interior, made them a different kind of being from those without that capacity. Marcus Hale was evidence against that assumption. Or he was evidence that the assumption was true, but that the shaping had produced something more patient and more careful rather than less. I thought about what it meant that the galaxy had looked at what was in the center of that amber corridor and asked for it to be buried, and humanity had agreed, because burial was its own kind of statement. A statement that said, "We could show you more, and we are choosing not to." I put down my fork. "Marcus," I said. He looked up. "The sketch," I said. "In the notebook. Why?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the deciding pause. Something else, without the familiar shape of his usual pauses, something that moved differently under the surface. "Because I wanted to," he said. 3 words. From a man who selected every word for necessity and discarded the rest without hesitation. I looked at him for a moment. Then I looked at the viewport and the stars and the quiet station holding itself together around us. "I am going to stop writing in my journal about you," I said. "All right," he said. "I have been writing in it about you since the first day on the station." "I know," he said. I looked at him. "You know, Nira mentioned it," he said. Not with amusement, not with judgment. With the same delivery as information he had received and filed. "What did she tell you?" "That you were thorough," he said, "and that you were going to end up in considerable trouble." I stared at him. That corner of his mouth moved. Further than any previous movement in 63 days. Further than I had seen it move in any of the meals, any of the morning cups, any of the corridor conversations, or the shuttle flights, or the evening exchanges at the viewport table. It was the closest thing to a full smile I had seen from him. "She was not wrong," I said. "No," he agreed. "She wasn't." He looked at the stars. I looked at his face. Out in the wide dark, the galaxy was doing its arithmetic. The collective worlds and the Geth sovereignty, and every independent system with a monitoring relay, were drawing their conclusions from the story of a peace station and 43 soldiers and 4 minutes, and the conclusions they were drawing were not subtle and were not incorrect. Humanity had placed something at the peace table that could not be removed from it by force. The peace table was, accordingly, safe. Something about that sentence had more weight in it than I had initially given it. The galaxy had signed a treaty because it had made a calculation. The calculation had rested on what had happened at Kesh Hollow, and what had come after Kesh Hollow, and what was still, in the form of a man sitting across from me eating Adrian's cooking and looking at the stars, present and available and not particularly retired. Humanity had extended a courtesy. The courtesy was this: we could show you more, and we are not going to. My government had asked for a file to be buried, because the file frightened them. The collective worlds had been very quiet in the years following the treaty. The Geth sovereignty had renewed its non-aggression agreements, without the usual extended renegotiation it historically required. Everyone had done the arithmetic. Everyone had arrived at the same number. Marcus said, looking at the stars, without turning. "You're thinking loudly." "I am thinking about arithmetic," I said. "Whose?" "Everyone's," I said. "The Dominion Councils, the collective worlds, the sovereignty, they all arrive at the same answer, that this station, this arrangement, this peace, is real because it is held in place by something the alternative to it does not want to test. He was quiet. You, I said, and what you represent, and the things after you, the ones with higher classification, the things that did not get sent to a diplomatic posting because they are not the message, they are what comes after the message is not received. He looked at the viewport. Is that what this is? I said. Is that what I am sitting across from? A message? He turned and looked at me. A message is what I was sent as, he said. What I am is the person who practiced your name. I held that, just held it for a moment. Tomorrow, I said, I want to learn how you cook, not Adrian's method, yours, the Wednesday version. He looked at me, the 2-second pause. All right, he said. Outside the viewport, the stars continued their particular motion, the slow drift of things that are not moving but appear to be because we are, carried forward by the momentum of whatever we have chosen to be part of. I had come to this station to survive an arrangement. My mother had given me 3 words, survive this. She had pressed jewelry into my hands with dry eyes and turned away, and those 3 words had been the whole of her instruction, survive. I had done that. I had done considerably more than that, though I was not certain yet what to call the additional thing. My journal was full of data that I had labeled as intelligence and then not treated as intelligence. Observations that had served no strategic purpose except to accumulate into something I now had to live with. A portrait built over 63 days. A man who maintained the same 2-second pause, whether deciding to speak about classified engagements or whether Wednesday cooking was worth replicating. A man whose own people stood a careful distance from him and found in that distance both caution and comfort simultaneously. Both things at once, the way you can feel 2 contradictory things in your body without having to choose between them. The peace between my people and his was real. Whatever existed inside the peace was realer. And somewhere past the edge of the viewport, past the Dominion's 11 systems and humanity's border space, and all the systems that had made their calculations and come to their careful conclusions, there were things in the dark that had not yet understood what they were looking at when they looked at humanity. They would understand eventually. Marcus sat across from me with his notebook in his still hands and his eyes the color of a sky in the last moment before everything changes. He was not the most capable thing humanity had sent to the stars. He had told me so himself. In exactly the same voice he used for any other fact. I believed him, which was the most clarifying thing I had learned in 63 days, and the most frightening, and I held it the way you hold something that has already changed the shape of your hands simply by being in them long enough. I thought about tomorrow and learning to cook the Wednesday version of a meal in a kitchen, on a joint station, at the gravitational midpoint of 2 species agreements. I thought about the practical, specific ordinariness of that, the choosing of ingredients, the particular attention Marcus would bring to the sequence of steps, the way he would explain things in the smallest unit that carried the meaning and nothing beyond it. I thought, this is what peace looks like from the inside, not the treaty language, not the classified files, not the 43 and the 4 minutes in the corridor that had emptied while I watched. This, 2 people at a table, one of them the most dangerous variable the galaxy had produced and chosen, so far, not to deploy. The other one glad about that in a way that had stopped being strategic somewhere around the 6th week and had been something else entirely since. I picked up my fork. Adrian's cooking was, as ever, better than the rotation average. The stars turned. The station held.